In 1929, the richest man in Los Angeles was found alone in his 55-room mansion, his son dead in the basement, his fortune built on a bribe delivered in a little black bag, his name attached to one of the worst corruption scandals in American history. He had started with a sharpened tree trunk and 400 borrowed dollars. He had ended with everything, and nothing left that mattered. That man was the real person Paul Thomas Anderson turned into Daniel Plainview. And the story of what happened to him, and to the dozens of real people and institutions that share his exact pattern of destruction, has never been told in full. There Will Be Blood is not a story about one greedy man. It is a precise map of how greed operates, what it costs, and why it always ends the same way, regardless of the era, or the industry, or the size of the fortune involved. 10 cases, 100 years. The same story every time. Welcome to Serial Soul. Let's begin. Section 1. The Man in the Hole. There is a scene near the start of There Will Be Blood where a man falls to the bottom of a mine shaft and breaks his leg. He is alone. There is no one coming to help him. The camera just watches as he lies there on the ground, his leg bent wrong, dirt on his face, and the silence of the desert pressing down on all of it. Most people in that moment would stop. Daniel Plainview does not stop. He climbs out of the mine shaft with a broken leg, dragging himself hand over hand up a wooden ladder, every movement an act of pure refusal. He gets to the top. He picks up a small rock sample he chipped out of the wall before he fell. He loads himself onto a mule. He rides for what the film suggests is a very long distance. And he walks into an assay office, a place where men bring ore samples to find out if they are worth anything, and he puts the rock down on the counter. The rock is worth something. He gets his claim. And the film moves on, as if none of that was remarkable. It was 1898. The year is a fact. The setting is New Mexico. And the 15 minutes that follow that opening scene contain almost no dialogue at all. Paul Thomas Anderson, who wrote and directed the film, made the choice to tell the beginning of Plainview's story almost entirely through image and sound. You watch a man work. You watch him dig and drill and push and haul. You watch him fall into a mine shaft, recover, and keep going. You watch him build a small oil operation with his own hands. You watch a worker die in an accident. And you watch Plainview pick up that worker's baby and keep moving. No speeches, no explanations. Just work, and what the work costs, and what the man is willing to pay. This opening matters more than almost anything else in the film, because it shows you who Daniel Plainview was before greed made him into something else. He was not stupid. He was not lazy. He was not handed anything. In 1898, he was a man alone in the desert with a pickaxe and an idea, and he was willing to crawl out of a hole on a broken leg if it meant he got to keep going. That quality, that absolute refusal to stop, is what made him rich. It is also what destroyed him. The film spans nearly 30 years, from 1898 to 1927. In those 30 years, Daniel Plainview goes from a man with nothing to a man with everything anyone could want. Land, money, power, a business that prints wealth like a machine. By the end, he is living alone in a mansion with a bowling alley in the basement, drunk by himself, screaming at people who are no longer there. The thing the film is asking, quietly, from the very first frame, is this: when did the winning stop being enough? When did having more become the only thing left? The answer is built into that opening scene, if you know how to read it. When Plainview climbs out of the mine shaft with a broken leg and a rock sample, he is not thinking about the pain. He is not thinking about the fact that he could have died. He is thinking about the claim. The rock in his hand is proof of something. It is a number. It is progress. And for Daniel Plainview, progress is the only language that makes sense. The only thing that quiets whatever is going on inside him is movement. Forward. More. Next. That is not ambition in the normal sense of the word. Ambition is wanting something. What Plainview has is closer to an inability to stop, which is a very different thing and a much scarier one. The film gives you one real look inside him, in a moment that happens not at the beginning or the end, but somewhere in the middle. He is trying to convince a family in a small California town to let him drill on their land. He has brought his young son, H.W., with him, a boy he adopted after the boy's father died in one of his early drilling accidents. Plainview is charming and warm and fatherly in these scenes, the kind of man you would trust with your property without thinking twice. Then the family steps away, and Plainview's face changes. Not dramatically, not in a way you could point to and describe precisely, but something behind his eyes closes. The warmth drains out. He looks like a man doing a calculation, not a man having a conversation. And then the family comes back, and the warmth returns instantly, like a lamp being switched on. That face, in that moment, is the film's true subject. Daniel Plainview's greed did not make him cruel. He was already something complicated before the money arrived. What the money did was remove every reason he had to pretend otherwise. In 1898, he needed people. He needed workers, investors, the goodwill of the families whose land sat above the oil. He needed H.W., not just as a son, but as a signal to the world that he was safe, that he was one of them, that he cared about something besides the oil. And so he performed all of those things, performed them skillfully, performed them so well that even the people watching the film sometimes get confused about whether any of it was real. By the time 1927 arrives, he does not need anyone. He is finished with the performance. And in the bowling alley at the end, alone with a bottle and a man he despises, you see what Daniel Plainview looks like when there is nothing left to want and no reason to pretend he ever wanted anything else. He looks exactly like the man in the hole, except now the hole has no bottom. The real history surrounding this film makes all of this worse, not better, because the man Daniel Plainview is based on actually existed. His name was Edward L. Doheny. He was born in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin in 1856. His father was an Irish laborer. His mother was a school teacher. He spent years drifting across the American Southwest, working any job that would take him. Mule driving, mining, singing in bars, hiring himself out as a guard. By some accounts, he had killed a man in Texas. By 1892, he was in Los Angeles, living in a boarding house where he had not paid the rent in so long that leaving was probably easier than facing the landlord. Then one day, he saw a wagon driver hauling a load of black, greasy rock. He asked what it was. The driver said, "Brea," Spanish for tar. It came from a vacant lot near a park, not far from where they were standing. Doheny took a streetcar to the lot, looked at the black ooze seeping out of the ground, and understood what he was looking at. He found a friend who could loan him $400. They leased 3 lots. Using a sharpened tree trunk as a drill, no machine, no equipment, just a length of wood hammered into the earth, they struck oil at 200 feet. Within a few years, there were more than 3,000 oil wells in the city of Los Angeles. Doheny had started all of it with a sharpened stick and a streetcar fare. By 1925, Edward Doheny was worth $100 million. That is roughly $1.8 billion in today's money. He was worth more than John D. Rockefeller at the same moment in time. He owned a 55-room mansion in Beverly Hills called Greystone. He gave money to churches, libraries, the Catholic Church. He built buildings at the University of Southern California. Los Angeles loved him. He had arrived with nothing and built an empire, and the city saw itself in him. The same year his net worth reached those numbers, his son was under criminal indictment. So was Doheny himself. They had bribed a government official. The money had been delivered in a bag, a little black bag according to testimony, carried by hand from father to son. The official who took it went to prison. Doheny was acquitted. His son died under circumstances that were never fully explained, found alongside his personal assistant with 2 gunshot wounds in a room of the mansion Doheny had given him as a wedding present. Doheny lived for 6 more years after his son's death. He spent most of them in court. That is the story the film is telling, not the rise. The rise is the easy part, and the rise is real, and the rise is genuinely something. A man with nothing who built everything through sheer refusal to be beaten by a desert and a broken leg and a life that offered him almost no starting advantages. The story is what happens when the drive that got you out of the hole does not know how to stop driving once there is no more hole to climb out of. Plainview says it himself in one of the few moments in the film where he speaks plainly about what is happening inside him. He is talking to a man he believes might be his half-brother, a stranger who has appeared claiming to be family. He trusts the man enough to say this: "There are times when I look at people and I see nothing worth liking. I want to earn enough money so I can get away from everyone." That line does not sound like ambition. It sounds like something being treated by money that money cannot actually fix. And that is the first thing There Will Be Blood teaches about greed. That the people who fall into it hardest are not always the ones who love money the most. Sometimes they are the ones who need it to do a job it was never designed to do. To make the world feel safer. To silence something that will not stop. To put enough distance between themselves and other people that whatever they feel when they are around them stops hurting quite so much. The oil did not do that for Doheny. It did not do that for Plainview. It made them richer and lonelier at the same time. And by the end, both of them were in rooms they had built themselves, surrounded by everything they had ever worked for. And there was no one left they trusted enough to let inside. But the question of where that drive comes from, and whether it was ever really about money at all, becomes much clearer when you look at the man whose actual fingerprints are on the system. Plainview and Doheny were both playing in. Because while Doheny was drilling a hole in Los Angeles with a sharpened tree trunk, someone else was already 30 years ahead of him. Someone who had already figured out that the oil itself was almost beside the point. What mattered was who controlled the roads it traveled on, and what you could do to anyone who tried to use those roads without your permission. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Plainview climbed out of that hole through sheer refusal to stop. What he could not have known in 1898 was that the industry he was clawing his way into had already been conquered by a man who never needed to climb out of anything, because he had figured out how to own the hole before anyone else reached it. Section 2. The Man Who Bought the Roads. John D. Rockefeller never drilled a single oil well. That detail gets lost in almost every telling of his story, because the story is so enormous. The richest man in America, the first billionaire, the man who controlled 90% of the oil in the United States. that it seems like he must have been out there in the field somewhere, doing what Doheny did, doing what Plainview does in the film's opening, getting his hands dirty and earning it through sweat and broken bones. He was not. Rockefeller was in Cleveland, Ohio, sitting in an office, reading contracts. He was 23 years old when he went into business for himself, 24 when the first oil well in American history was drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and he spent the next few years watching other men go crazy trying to get rich off the oil before he made his move. The move was not to drill. The move was to build a refinery, the place where raw oil gets cleaned and processed into something people can actually use. And while every other ambitious young man in America was scrambling to find oil in the ground, Rockefeller was quietly figuring out that the men who found it still needed someone to process it, and whoever controlled the processing held all the cards. By 1870, he had turned that refinery into the Standard Oil Company, incorporated in Ohio. By 1872, within the first 3 months of that year alone, he had bought out, shut down, or driven into bankruptcy 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland. He did this not by producing better oil or by working harder than the men around him. He did it by negotiating a secret deal with the railroads. The railroads were the only way to move oil in 1872. There were no pipelines yet. There were no trucks. If you refined oil in Cleveland and wanted to sell it anywhere outside of walking distance, you put it on a train. Every refiner in the city used the same railroads. Every refiner paid the same rates. Except Rockefeller. He went to the railroad companies and made them an offer. He guaranteed them a fixed, enormous volume of business. 60 full rail cars of oil every single day, a number no other refiner in the city could come close to matching. In exchange, the railroads gave him something called a rebate, a secret discount on his shipping costs that nobody else was getting. His competitors were paying the published rate. Rockefeller was quietly paying less. This meant that even if a competitor ran his refinery just as well as Rockefeller ran his, even if he was just as smart, just as hard-working, just as skilled, he could not beat Rockefeller on price. His costs were higher before his oil left the building. He was already losing before the competition began. And it got worse. Not only did the railroads give Rockefeller a discount on his own shipments, in some arrangements, they also gave him a portion of the fees paid by his competitors. Meaning every time a rival sent oil down the railroad, Rockefeller made money on it. He was collecting a kind of invisible tax on the entire industry, paid by the people trying to compete with him, routed directly into his pocket. By 1880, the New York World newspaper called Standard Oil the most cruel, impudent, pitiless, and grasping monopoly that ever fastened upon a country. That description came from journalists. The people running Standard Oil described their own work rather differently. Rockefeller himself, asked about the way he handled competition, reportedly said that competition was a sin. He genuinely believed that the chaos of too many companies fighting for the same customers was bad for everyone. Bad for prices, bad for quality, bad for the industry as a whole. His solution to that chaos was to eliminate it by eliminating the competitors. And he saw this as a service he was providing to the market, not a crime he was committing against it. This is one of the more chilling things about the history of Standard Oil, and it maps precisely onto what There Will Be Blood is doing with Daniel Plainview. Plainview does not see himself as a villain. He sees himself as a man who is better at this than everyone else, a man who deserves what he takes, because he is the one willing to do what it costs to take it. When he buys land in the small California town of Little Boston at a price the families think is fair, he never tells them that the land is sitting on an enormous oil deposit. When he uses his young son as a prop to make himself look like a trustworthy family man, he does not experience this as lying. He experiences it as strategy. He is just playing the game more intelligently than the people around him. Rockefeller thought the same way. The railroad deals were not secret because he knew they were wrong. They were secret because making them public would have caused a political problem. And political problems were inefficiencies, and inefficiencies were the enemy. The goal was to control the entire process: refining, transport, storage, distribution, so thoroughly that oil could not move anywhere in America without going through something that belonged to Standard Oil. And he very nearly achieved it. By 1882, he had invented something called a trust, a legal structure that allowed him to tie together 40 separate companies across multiple states into a single operation controlled by a small group of people at the center. The Standard Oil Trust controlled approximately 90% of refining capacity in the United States. There was no meaningful oil industry in America outside of what Rockefeller owned or managed or profited from. The people who suffered most visibly were the small operators. Ida Tarbell was a journalist whose father had been an oil producer in western Pennsylvania. He had built a small business, worked honestly, and competed fairly. Then Standard Oil arrived in his region. The secret railroad deals kicked in, and his costs became impossible to manage. His business failed. His family's livelihood, built over years, dissolved in a matter of months, because the rules of the game had been changed underneath him without his knowledge. Tarbell spent years investigating what had happened to her father and to thousands of men like him. She published her findings in a magazine called McClure's across 19 separate articles running from 1902 to 1904, then collected everything into a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company. The book documented the railroad deals, the secret payments, the systematic destruction of competitors who had no idea why they were suddenly losing. It caused enormous public anger and is widely credited with shifting popular opinion against Standard Oil so dramatically that the government felt it had no choice but to act. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt's administration filed a lawsuit arguing that Standard Oil was conspiring to prevent fair competition. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an unreasonable monopoly and ordered it broken into 39 separate companies. Here is the part of that story that tends to get left out of the simple version. Rockefeller owned roughly a quarter of the shares in Standard Oil. When the trust was broken up into 39 companies, each of those companies became independently valuable on the stock market, and many of them doubled in value almost immediately. The breakup that was designed to punish Rockefeller and reduce his power over the American economy actually made him significantly richer. He went into the dissolution as one of the wealthiest men in the country and came out of it wealthier still. Some of those 39 companies eventually recombined over the following century into corporations that still exist today. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Those two later merged into ExxonMobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. The companies that the government created by smashing Rockefeller's monopoly are among the largest corporations on Earth right now. That fact does not prove that the breakup was pointless. It proves something else, something that There Will Be Blood understands deeply. That systems built on the logic of accumulation do not simply stop when the person at the center is removed. The logic persists. The structure finds new containers. The straw gets longer. Rockefeller himself retired from daily business in the mid-1890s, long before the legal battles concluded. He spent his later decades giving money away, funding universities and medical research and public health programs. He donated more than $500 million before his death. He lived to 97 years old, the longest living major American industrialist of his era, outlasting almost everyone who had competed with him, almost everyone who had tried to expose him, almost everyone who had suffered because of what he built. Daniel Plainview does not get that ending. He ends the film alone and violent in a room full of expensive furniture, with nothing left that he cares about, and no one left who could reach him if they tried. The difference between Plainview and Rockefeller is not in the method, the willingness to freeze people out, to use whatever pressure is available, to treat competition as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be tolerated. The difference is that Rockefeller managed, somehow, to maintain the outer shape of a life. He had a family he did not destroy. He had a public image he spent real money and real effort to protect. He had enough self-awareness to step back before the machine consumed him. Plainview has none of that. He consumes HW and then discards him. He consumes every town he drills in. He consumes every person who gets close enough to need something from him. And at the end, he is finished. His own word, the last word he speaks in the film. Not because the oil ran out, but because there was nothing left inside him that had not already been burned up funding the engine. Rockefeller reportedly said in later life that all the fortune he had made had not served to compensate him for the anxiety of the years he spent building it. He could not sleep. He lived on the edge of a breakdown for most of the period when Standard Oil was becoming what it became. The money was arriving in quantities that no human being in history had ever accumulated, and he was not able to enjoy a night's rest. That is the piece that tends to get forgotten when people talk about the Rockefellers and the Plainviews of the world, as if they were simply winning at a game the rest of us are also playing. The cost of total accumulation is paid in the currency of everything else. What goes into the engine does not come back out. And Rockefeller, at least, eventually stepped away from the machine before the machine stepped away from him. The men who came after him in the oil business, the ones who found the oil he was refining, the ones who fought over the land beneath the surface, the ones who discovered that the American government itself could be purchased with the right amount of money in the right kind of bag, were not always so careful about knowing when to stop. One of those men was already building an empire in Washington, while Doheny was drilling in Los Angeles and Rockefeller was counting his dividends in New York. His name was Albert Fall, and he was the Secretary of the Interior of the United States of America. And what he understood, what he had figured out, which was something even Rockefeller, with all his railroad deals, had never quite attempted, was that the oil sitting on government land was, in a sense, already paid for by the American public. It just needed someone willing to redirect it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fall took the money and the leases and built his justification around a piece of real science, a real legal doctrine, a real physical phenomenon that he used to make the corruption sound like common sense. That doctrine had a name, and the man who put it into the most famous speech in American cinema found it in the transcript of Fall's own testimony. Section 3. The bag with the money in it. Albert Fall was not a criminal when he started. That matters because the easy version of the Teapot Dome story, the version that gets taught in history classes and summarized in 2 paragraphs, makes him sound like a man who arrived in Washington already corrupt, all ready for sale, just waiting for someone to name the right price. The reality is more uncomfortable than that. Because the reality is that Albert Fall was, by most accounts, a capable and respected man who made a choice. And the choice he made was one that the film There Will Be Blood understands very well. That when the opportunity to take what you want is sitting directly in front of you, and you have spent your whole life watching other men take things while you worked honestly for smaller rewards, the temptation does not arrive loudly. It arrives quietly, dressed up as something that almost makes sense. Fall was born in Kentucky in 1861. He moved to the American Southwest as a young man, working as a cowboy, a miner, a lawyer, and eventually a politician. He was one of the first 2 senators from the state of New Mexico when it became a state in 1912. He served in the Senate for 9 years. He was known as a man who understood the West, who understood land and oil and cattle, who had spent his life in the dirt rather than in drawing rooms. When President Warren G. Harding won the election of 1920 and began assembling his cabinet, he appointed Albert Fall as the Secretary of the Interior, the government official responsible for managing America's public lands and natural resources. This was, on paper, an enormous amount of power. The Interior Department controlled millions of acres of land that belonged to the American people. Sitting underneath some of that land was oil, enormous quantities of it, set aside specifically for the United States Navy, which had converted its ships from coal power to oil power in the years before World War I, and needed a guaranteed supply in case of emergency. There were 3 of these reserves. One was at Elk Hills in California, one was at Buena Vista Hills, also in California. The third was in Wyoming, on land near a rock formation that locals had always called Teapot Dome because of its shape. These reserves were not supposed to be drilled. They were emergency stores. The Navy wanted to know that if a war came and commercial oil supplies were disrupted, there was oil in the ground that belonged to them and nobody else. This was the plan, and it had been the plan for years. And it was a reasonable plan, and Albert Fall, as the new Secretary of the Interior, understood all of it perfectly. In 1921, Fall convinced the Secretary of the Navy to transfer control of the Naval Petroleum Reserves from the Navy Department to the Interior Department. He told the Navy Secretary this made administrative sense. He told President Harding the same thing. Harding signed the executive order without apparent concern. The oil reserves were now under Fall's control. What happened next unfolded quietly, in private meetings, in correspondence, in handshakes between men who understood each other. Fall reached out to 2 oil company owners he knew personally. One was Edward Doheny, the Los Angeles tycoon, the real-life Daniel Plainview, the man who had turned a sharpened tree trunk and 400 borrowed dollars into one of the largest oil fortunes in America. The other was Harry Sinclair, who ran the Sinclair Consolidated Oil Corporation, one of the most powerful oil companies in the country. Fall offered each of them something no private oil company was supposed to be able to get: the right to drill in the Naval Petroleum Reserves. Not through a public bidding process where other companies could compete and the government could choose the best offer. In secret. No bidding, no competition. Just a private deal, quietly arranged, for the right to pump oil from land that belonged to the American public. Doheny received the lease for Elk Hills in California. Sinclair received the lease for Teapot Dome in Wyoming. In exchange, Albert Fall received money. Doheny sent the payment in cash, $100,000. He gave it to his son, Ned, who put it in a bag. The testimony later described it as a little black bag, and carried it by hand to Washington, where he delivered it to Fall in person. Doheny testified about this himself, openly, during the Senate investigation that followed. He said he had instructed his son to deliver the money. He called it a loan. He said there was nothing improper about it. Sinclair's payments to Fall were larger and more spread out. Sinclair gave Fall $269,000 in government bonds and cash after signing the Teapot Dome lease. He also gave Fall several cattle for his ranch in New Mexico. The total value of what Fall received from both men came to roughly $400,000, which in today's money would be several $1,000,000. For this, the men received the right to drill on federal land containing hundreds of millions of barrels of oil. Doheny's company expected to extract 250 million barrels from Elk Hills alone. Oil that belonged to the Navy. Oil that belonged to the American people. Oil that had been set aside specifically so that it would be there when the country needed it. The first person to notice that something strange was happening was not a journalist or a government investigator. It was a small, independent oil man in Wyoming named Leslie Miller, who later became the governor of that state. He saw trucks with the Sinclair Company logo hauling drilling equipment into the Teapot Dome Naval Reserve and knew immediately that the equipment should not be there. He contacted a senator from Wyoming named John Kendrick, who brought it to the Senate. A senator from Montana named Thomas Walsh took over the investigation. He spent months working through financial records, interviewing witnesses, tracing payments. The investigation was painstaking and often frustrating. Fall had covered his tracks carefully in most places, but Walsh kept going. And eventually he found the one thing Fall had failed to hide: the record of Doheny's $100,000 payment. The loan that was not a loan, delivered in a bag, carried by hand from a son to the man who had just given his father the right to drill on government land. The scandal became public in 1924. It caused immediate national outrage. President Harding, who had signed the original executive order and whose administration was at the center of the story, died of a heart attack in 1923 before the full extent of the corruption had been revealed. Some historians believe the stress of what was coming contributed to his death. There is no way to prove that, and it is worth saying clearly, Harding was not directly implicated in the bribe payments themselves, but the people around him had done what they had done, on his watch, inside his administration, and his reputation did not survive it. Fall resigned from the cabinet in 1923 and went to work for Sinclair's company, the same man whose payments to him were under investigation. He was eventually convicted of accepting a bribe in connection with the Elk Hills lease. He was fined $100,000, which was exactly the amount Doheny had paid him. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison. He became the first cabinet official in the history of the United States to go to prison for crimes committed while in office. Doheny and Sinclair were both acquitted of the main bribery charges. They had paid the bribes that Fall was convicted of accepting, and they walked free. A reporter covering the verdicts wrote at the time, "You cannot convict $1 million." That sentence has stayed in the historical record because it said plainly what the outcome of the trials demonstrated. Fall, who had taken the money, went to prison. The men who had given it to him, who had received the oil leases in exchange, who had stood to make fortunes from the arrangement, they paid fines, served time on lesser charges, and returned to their lives. Sinclair served 9 months in prison, but on a charge of contempt of Congress, not bribery. He had hired private detectives to follow the members of the jury during his original bribery trial. That was the thing they convicted him for. Not the oil, not the government land, the jury tampering. The Supreme Court eventually ruled in 1927 that both oil leases had been corruptly obtained and canceled them. The government got the land back. The Teapot Dome oil field sat idle for 49 years after the scandal, before anyone drilled it again. Now step back from the legal details and look at what the structure of this story actually is, because it is the structure of There Will Be Blood, almost exactly. Daniel Plainview arrives in a community. The community has something he wants: oil under their land. He presents himself as a man who is going to help them. He makes promises. He uses whatever is available to him, his charm, his son, his apparent decency, to get access to what he actually came for. And once he has what he came for, the promises dissolve and the relationship ends. Albert Fall arrived in government. The government had something the oil companies wanted: land with oil under it. Fall presented himself as a public servant managing those resources for the benefit of the country. And once the deal was made, the land changed hands and the money went into a bag. The film never shows you a villain who knows he is a villain. Daniel Plainview does not pace his mansion rehearsing speeches about how much he loves money. He talks about his work as if it is a calling, as if finding oil and bringing it to the surface is something he was born to do, and the world is lucky to have him doing it. There is a scene early in the film where he stands in front of a group of families in Little Boston and describes what his company will do for their town: the roads he will build, the schools he will fund, the jobs he will create. And he is so convincing that you almost believe he means it. Maybe some small part of him does. Fall almost certainly told himself a version of the same story. He came from the West. He believed that public lands should be in private hands, that the government was an inefficient steward of resources that businessmen would manage better. He had said this publicly for years before he became Interior Secretary. So when he arranged the leases, he may have genuinely believed, at least in the beginning, that getting Doheny and Sinclair onto that land was better for the country than leaving the oil in the ground. He may have told himself the money was incidental, a loan between friends, a reasonable arrangement. The bag did not care what story he told himself. The bag contained $100,000 in cash, and it traveled from Los Angeles to Washington in the hands of a man's son. And when it arrived, it purchased a piece of the United States government. That is what greed does to systems. It does not always arrive with a mask on. Often, it arrives with paperwork and a handshake, and a very reasonable explanation for why this particular arrangement makes sense for everyone involved. The thing about Daniel Plainview that makes the film so hard to look away from is that his explanations usually do make sense, at least in the moment he is giving them. The logic of taking more is always easier to follow than the logic of knowing when enough is enough. Fall understood the oil. He understood the land. He understood the men on both sides of the transaction. What he did not understand, or chose not to consider, was what happens to a person when they let that logic run without any limit. He found out the way most people in this story found out. At the end, in a courtroom, with everything he had built already gone. But the version of this story that is most directly written into the film, the speech, the moment, the line that people are still quoting almost 20 years after the movie came out, did not come from the bribes themselves. It came from something Fall said in one of those Senate hearings, trying to explain a specific oil drilling technique, reaching for the simplest image he could find to make a room full of senators understand how one man could steal what was underneath another man's ground without that man ever seeing it happen. He used a milkshake. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fall took the money and the leases and built his justification around a piece of real science, a real legal doctrine, a real physical phenomenon, that he used to make the corruption sound like common sense. That doctrine had a name, and the man who put it into the most famous speech in American cinema found it in the transcript of Fall's own testimony. Section 4. The straw across the room. The most famous scene in There Will Be Blood happens near the very end of the film. Daniel Plainview is in the basement of his mansion, drunk, sitting in a bowling alley he had built for himself at the bottom of a 55-room house. A man named Eli Sunday has come to see him. A preacher, a man who has spent years as Plainview's rival and enemy and occasional business partner. A man who believes he has finally found a deal that will benefit them both. Eli has access to a piece of land that Plainview has always wanted. A holdout property. One small plot that Plainview was never able to buy during his years of acquiring everything around it. The man who owned it refused to sell. Now that man is dead. Eli has arranged access to the land and has come to offer it to Plainview in exchange for a commission. Plainview listens. Then he laughs. And then he explains to Eli, in slow and deliberate detail, that the deal Eli has come to offer is worthless. The oil under that land, the oil Eli thinks is still sitting there waiting, is already gone. Plainview drained it years ago. He drilled on the land next to it, angled his wells sideways, and pulled the oil out from underneath the holdout property without ever setting foot on it. He reaches for an image to explain how this works. He picks up a glass and a straw. If you have a milkshake, he says, and I have a milkshake, and I have a straw that reaches all the way across the room and into your glass, then I drink your milkshake. I drink it up. The oil was already gone, had been gone for years, and Eli never knew. Paul Thomas Anderson, who wrote and directed the film, confirmed in interviews that this speech did not come from his imagination. He found it in the written record of the 1924 United States Senate hearings on the Teapot Dome scandal. During those hearings, as senators questioned the men involved in the illegal oil lease deals, the subject of oil drainage came up. The question of whether oil underneath one piece of land could be removed by a well drilled on a neighboring piece of land. Albert Fall, explaining this concept to the Senate committee, reached for the simplest image he could think of. He described it almost exactly the way the film does. If you have a milkshake, and I have a milkshake, and my straw reaches across the room, I will end up drinking your milkshake. Anderson took that image, almost word for word, and gave it to Daniel Plainview as his final, defining speech. The most quotable line in the movie, the line that became a catchphrase, that still gets repeated, that is still used as a shorthand for a specific kind of ruthless winning, came from a Senate corruption hearing in 1924, spoken by a man who was at that moment under investigation for accepting bribes. That origin changes how the speech lands, or at least it should. In the film, the milkshake line is the moment where Plainview stops pretending. For the entire runtime, he has been managing his image, presenting himself as a family man, as a community builder, as a straight dealer who delivers what he promises. The milkshake speech is the end of that performance. He is not trying to convince Eli of anything. He is not trying to get something from him. He has already taken what he wanted years ago, through a method so invisible that the man whose oil he stole never noticed it happening. The speech is not business. It is cruelty. He is explaining to Eli how completely and thoroughly he has been beaten, in terms simple enough that even Eli cannot miss the point. But the real milkshake story, the legal and historical reality that Anderson was drawing from, is not about cruelty. It is about a law. The legal principle at work is called the rule of capture. and it was one of the foundational rules governing oil in America during the period the film covers. The rule of capture said, in simple terms, that oil underground does not belong to the person whose land sits above it until that person actually pulls it out of the ground. Oil migrates. It moves through underground rock. It follows pressure. A deposit of oil might sit beneath 5 different properties at the same time, spread unevenly, shifting gradually. The law could not assign ownership to something so mobile and so invisible. So the rule became, whoever gets it out of the ground first owns it. This meant that if your neighbor drilled a well on his own property and angled it in a direction that pulled oil out from beneath your land, the oil he brought up was legally his. He had captured it. You still owned the dirt above where the oil used to be. The oil itself was gone, and you had no legal claim against the man who took it, because he had followed the rule. He drilled on his own land. He captured what he reached. This rule was not a loophole that clever lawyers invented after the fact. It was written into American oil law from the very beginning of the industry, and it shaped almost everything that happened in California and Oklahoma and Texas and Wyoming during the period There Will Be Blood depicts. It meant that the moment a significant oil deposit was discovered anywhere, every landowner near it was in a race without knowing they were racing. If they did not drill, their neighbor might drain the oil from beneath them. If they drilled, but their neighbor drilled faster or deeper or at a better angle, the oil was gone. Speed and positioning and access to money to pay for drilling equipment, these were the things that determined who won, not who owned the land above the deposit in the first place. Daniel Plainview understands this completely. The entire strategy of his land acquisition in Little Boston, the way he buys up property after property around the Sunday family's farm, the urgency with which he moves, the willingness to pay prices that seem generous in order to lock up the surrounding land quickly. All of it is built on the logic of the rule of capture. He is not just buying oil rights. He is buying angles. He is buying the ability to put his straw wherever he needs it to reach whatever he wants to drink. The holdout property, the one small piece of land he could never get, was the one gap in his coverage, the one angle he could not reach. And so what he did, quietly, without the holdout's knowledge or consent, was drill as close to it as his own land allowed and pull the oil out sideways. By the time Eli comes to him with the deed to that land, there is nothing left under it. The milkshake is empty. Albert Fall, when he used this image in the Senate hearing, was trying to justify the Teapot Dome leases. His argument was that the naval petroleum reserves, the oil that belonged to the government, set aside for the Navy, were being drained from the outside. Private companies were drilling on land adjacent to the reserves, and by the rule of capture, they were legally pulling government oil out from underneath government land. The only way to stop this drainage, Fall argued, was to get somebody drilling inside the reserves, producing oil fast enough to capture it before the neighbors got it all. This argument was not entirely fabricated. The drainage concern was real. Other companies were drilling near the reserves. The rule of capture was real. The legal mechanism Fall described was accurate. What was not accurate was the claim that handing the reserves to Doheny and Sinclair, in secret, with no competitive bidding, in exchange for hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and bonds and cattle, was the necessary and only solution to that problem. The problem was real. The solution was a bribe, dressed up in the language of practical necessity. This is the move that There Will Be Blood is most interested in. Not the greed itself, but the explanation that travels alongside it. Plainview always has an explanation. When he uses HW to appear trustworthy, there is a logic to it. He needs the families to trust him. And a man traveling with a child reads differently than a man traveling alone. And the deals he is offering genuinely will bring money to these communities, even if the money will benefit him far more than it benefits them. When he drains the oil from the holdout property without permission, there is a logic to it. The law allows it. The rule of capture is the rule. He did not break any written law by doing what he did. The logic is always technically correct. The logic is always beside the point. Fall's milkshake explanation was technically correct. Oil drainage was a real phenomenon. The rule of capture was a real law. What the explanation left out was that the person making the argument was also the person who had accepted the money. The explanation and the bribe existed at the same time, in the same transaction, spoken by the same man. The logic was real. The corruption was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, and the logic did not cancel out the corruption, though Fall seemed to believe it might. The image he chose, a milkshake, a straw, a glass across a room, is so ordinary and so domestic that it almost disguises what it is actually describing. A child understands a milkshake. A straw reaching across a room is a funny, slightly absurd picture. There is nothing in the image that signals danger or theft or the permanent loss of something that could never be replaced. It sounds almost like a magic trick, the kind of thing you would show a kid to make them laugh. But what it describes is a system in which the wealth sitting beneath your land, wealth you may never have known was there, wealth you have done nothing to forfeit, can be taken from you by someone positioned nearby who understands the angle better than you do, without your knowledge, without your consent, without any violation of the written law. Just gone one day, the way a milkshake goes when a straw finds the bottom of the glass. Anderson heard that image in the Senate record and understood immediately that it was the entire film he was trying to make, compressed into a single sentence. He put it in Plainview's mouth at the moment of maximum cruelty, at the end of everything, when there was nothing left to perform and no more reason to soften any of it. The milkshake is empty. The oil is gone. The man who took it is sitting in a bowling alley with a bottle. And he is finished. What this doctrine produced in the real world, the rule of capture applied at scale across an entire nation in an era when enormous deposits of oil were being discovered under land owned by people who had no idea what they were sitting on, was not just the story of one man's greed. It was a machine, a system that rewarded speed and proximity and ruthlessness over fairness or prior claim or basic decency. And nowhere in American history did that machine produce results more devastating than in the northeast corner of Oklahoma in the early 1920s, when a group of men discovered that the richest oil land in the country belonged to people they had decided did not deserve to keep it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The milkshake doctrine was a law written for an industry moving faster than anyone could govern it. In California and Wyoming, it meant lost oil and broken deals and federal corruption charges. In northeast Oklahoma, it meant something considerably worse, because the people sitting above the richest oil deposits in the country had no idea the straw was already in their glass. Section 5. The richest people in the world. In 1865, the Osage Nation signed a treaty with the United States government and used the money from selling their land in Kansas to purchase a reservation in what would become the state of Oklahoma. They bought the land. They paid for it with their own funds. This was not land given to them or assigned to them by a government that decided where they should live. They chose it and they bought it, and the transaction was legal and documented, and the land was theirs. The United States government looked at that land and saw scrub brush and rocky soil and not much else. The Osage had made a poor deal by the government's assessment. They had paid for land that was not worth what they paid for it. Then, in the 1890s, oil was discovered underneath it. Not a little oil. Enormous quantities of oil, sitting in deposits beneath the Osage Reservation that turned out to be some of the largest in the entire country. The Oklahoma oil boom that followed was one of the most significant in American history, and the land at the center of it belonged to the Osage people, which meant that every oil company that wanted to drill there had to come to the Osage first, had to pay the Osage for the right to work on their land, and had to pay the Osage a share of whatever oil came out of the ground. When the United States Congress passed the Osage Allotment Act in 1906, a tribal lawyer made sure that one specific right was protected in the agreement: the subsurface mineral rights. The surface of the land could be sold or leased by individual Osage people. What was underneath it, the oil, the minerals, everything below the surface, belonged to the tribe as a whole. Every enrolled member of the Osage Nation received an equal share of the income from those mineral rights. That share was called a head right. There were 2,229 members on the tribal rolls in 1907, and each of them held one head right, which entitled them to an equal portion of the royalty payments that came in every quarter. As the oil boom built through the 1910s and into the early 1920s, those payments grew into sums that were almost impossible to comprehend. In 1923 alone, the Osage Nation received $30 million in oil royalties. In today's money, that is roughly $540 million, paid in a single year, divided among the head right holders. A family of 4 holding 4 head rights between them could receive the equivalent of nearly $1 million a year in modern terms. The Osage were described in newspapers of the era as the wealthiest people per capita on Earth. They built large houses. They bought cars, among the first people in Oklahoma to own automobiles. They hired servants. They sent their children to schools in the East. They wore fine clothes and traveled and lived in a way that the surrounding white communities found deeply uncomfortable, because the surrounding white communities had decided, without examining the decision very carefully, that this level of wealth was not something the Osage were supposed to have. What followed was called the Reign of Terror. That name came from the Osage people themselves, and it is the right name for what happened. It began with the structure of the head right system. A head right could not be bought or sold. The only way to obtain one was to inherit it from an Osage person who died. This meant that the head rights were locked inside the Osage community by design, unless a non-Osage person could position themselves to inherit one through marriage or family connection. And crucially, the 1906 Act allowed non-Osage people to inherit head rights from Osage members they were legally related to. If you married an Osage person and that person died, their head right passed to you. A cattle rancher and businessman named William K. Hale had lived in Osage County for years. He was known locally as the King of the Osage Hills. He was well-connected, respected by many in the community, and presented himself publicly as a friend to the Osage people. Behind that presentation was a plan that he had constructed carefully and over time. Hale recognized what the head right inheritance rule meant. He urged his nephew, a young man named Ernest Burkhart, who had come to Oklahoma after serving in World War I, to marry into the Osage community. Burkhart married a full-blooded Osage woman named Molly Kyle. Molly came from a family that held multiple head rights between them. Her mother, Lizzie, held head rights of her own, having inherited additional ones from other family members. Molly's sisters each held head rights. The Kyle family represented a significant concentration of oil wealth. Hale's plan was to have that wealth transferred to his nephew through death. If Molly's family members died, their head rights passed to their nearest heirs. If those heirs also died, the head rights concentrated further, moving closer to Molly. And if Molly died, everything she had inherited would pass to her husband Ernest. Ernest, as Hale's nephew, would then be expected to share the benefit with his uncle. In 1921, Molly Kyle's sister Anna Brown was found shot in the head in a remote area of Osage County. Around the same time, another Osage man named Charles Whitehorn was also found shot and killed. 2 months after Anna Brown's death, Molly's mother, Lizzie Kyle, died. The official explanation was natural causes. In 1923, Molly's cousin, Henry Roan, was shot and killed. That same year, Molly's sister Rita and Rita's husband, Bill Smith, were killed when their house exploded. A domestic worker who lived with them also died in the explosion. The head rights from these deaths flowed toward Molly. Molly, who by this point was sick, weakened and confused, suffering symptoms that her doctors could not clearly explain, was being treated by her husband with injections that she was told were insulin for her diabetes. Ernest Burkhardt was slowly poisoning her. The injections contained something other than insulin. She was being kept weak and disoriented, while the people around her died and their wealth accumulated in her name, waiting for the moment she too would die, and everything would pass to her husband, and from him to William K. Hale. This was not one man acting alone. Hale had assembled a network of people. Killers he hired, officials he bribed, local lawmen he had either bought or frightened into silence. A doctor who signed off on deaths that were not natural. A legal system in Osage County so thoroughly corrupted by Hale's money and influence that tribal appeals for help went nowhere. The Osage had reported the deaths to local authorities repeatedly. Local authorities had investigated minimally and concluded minimally and moved on. Between 1920 and 1925, more than 60 Osage people died under suspicious or openly violent circumstances in Osage County. 60 documented deaths, most of them connected in some way to the headright system, most of them involving Osage people who held wealth that non-Osage people stood to inherit. Many of those deaths were never seriously investigated. Some were never officially classified as murders at all. The Osage Tribal Council eventually appealed directly to the federal government, bypassing the local authorities who had proven useless or complicit. The Bureau of Investigation, the agency that would later become the FBI, sent agents to Oklahoma, including a former Texas Ranger named Tom White, who assembled a small team and spent months working undercover in Osage County, piecing together what had happened. The investigation eventually produced enough evidence to bring charges. Ernest Burkhardt, confronted with the case against him, pleaded guilty and was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. William K. Hale and a man named John Ramsey were also convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, though their first convictions were overturned and they had to be tried again before the second convictions were confirmed. Burkhardt was paroled in 1937, 20 years before his uncle was released. Hale was released from prison in 1947, despite strong protests from the Osage Nation. Now sit with what this story is, stripped of its specific details. A community has something of enormous value sitting beneath their land. Men from outside that community identify the value. Those men cannot take the thing directly. The law prevents it. The ownership is too clearly established. So they find the edges of the system, the places where the law allows transfer under specific conditions, and they work backward from there. They do not try to steal the oil. They try to inherit the people who own the oil.
And when inheritance requires death, they arrange for death. Daniel Plainview is not a murderer in the conventional sense of the story. His violence is personal and late and specific. But the logic of his accumulation is identical to the logic of William K. Hale. He identifies what he wants. He maps the path between himself and the thing he wants. He places himself along that path in whatever way the situation requires. He uses charm when charm works, and money when money works.
And the legal system, when the legal system works. And when none of those things work, he finds the angle, the straw across the room. The Osage case takes the film's metaphor out of the bowling alley and drops it into a neighborhood, into a family, into the body of a woman being slowly poisoned by a man she trusted. The straw in this case was a marriage certificate and a syringe. In 1925, Congress amended the 1906 Act to prohibit non-Osage people from inheriting head rights from Osage members who possessed more than half Osage blood. The law was changed because what had happened was so clearly monstrous that the government could not pretend the existing rules were adequate. But the change came after at least 60 people were dead, after years of appeals that went unanswered, after a community had spent half a decade living in a state of fear so complete that many Osage people refused to leave their homes after dark. The investigation into the Osage murders is considered one of the cases that established how the FBI approached complex criminal conspiracies. Undercover work, informants, the slow and methodical building of a case from the inside out. The Reign of Terror, in other words, helped create the institution that would later be used to investigate crimes like it. Something useful came from the wreckage. It does not balance the account. Molly Kyle survived. The poisoning was eventually stopped when the investigation closed in on Burkhart and the treatments ended. She recovered enough to testify. She watched her husband convicted of the murder of her family and lived for years after the trials were concluded. She died in 1937. What There Will Be Blood captures, and what the Osage story confirms in the most devastating way possible, is that greed operating without limit does not stop at inconvenience, or at decency, or even at law. It stops only when something external forces it to stop. Plainview stops when there is nothing left. Hale stopped when agents arrived with handcuffs. The oil itself, the thing at the center of all of it, the thing that made the Osage the richest people per capita on Earth and made them targets at the same moment, kept flowing. It did not know what had happened above it. It did not care. It just sat there in the dark, underneath the ground, waiting for whoever had the longest straw. The men who built their wealth on that oil, who purchased their way into the American economy on the back of what they drilled and sold and refined, they built things that lasted. Corporations, estates, legacies with their names attached. And the men who built those things, who sat at the top of the structures that made it all possible, had almost nothing in common with the roughnecks and the drillers and the workers who did the actual physical labor that the money was built on. That distance between the man at the top and the man in the ground is something There Will Be Blood is precise about. Andrew Carnegie understood it in his way. He built his fortune on the backs of men he never had to watch die, because he was always somewhere else when the dying happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Osage Reign of Terror was greed with its mask completely off. No paperwork, no legal justification, no performance of public service. Just a calculation about inheritance and a willingness to act on it. Most of the men in this story kept the mask on longer than Hale did. Carnegie kept it on for decades, long enough to build the most celebrated philanthropic legacy in American history, while the thing underneath it was still there, waiting for someone to look directly at it. Section 6. The Man in Scotland. Andrew Carnegie was at his castle in Scotland when the killing started. This is not a detail that gets added to soften the story or to give Carnegie an excuse. It is the central fact of the Homestead Strike of 1892, the event that cracked the public image of the man who was, at that moment, in the process of becoming the most celebrated example of the American dream that the country had ever produced. Carnegie had come from nothing, genuinely nothing. A child immigrant from Scotland whose family arrived in America with no money, no connections, and no guarantees. And he had built the largest steel company in the world through decades of calculated, relentless work. He had also written, 3 years before the killing started, an essay that told the world exactly what he believed rich men owed to the people who were not rich. The essay was published in 1889 in a magazine called the North American Review. Carnegie called it an essay about wealth, but history has come to know it as the gospel of wealth. In it, Carnegie argued that the accumulation of enormous personal fortunes was not only acceptable, but beneficial to society, because the men capable of accumulating such fortunes were also uniquely capable of using them wisely for the public good. The wealthy man, Carnegie wrote, was a kind of trustee, holding his fortune not entirely for himself, but for the benefit of the community, which he was better positioned to serve than any government or collective organization. He meant it. That matters for the same reason that Kenneth Lay signing the Enron Code of Ethics matters, and for the same reason that Albert Fall's genuine belief in private land management matters. The self-image of the man doing the taking is not always a cynical performance. Sometimes it is a real belief, held alongside real conduct that directly contradicts it. And the person holding the belief does not experience the contradiction because the structure of his life makes the contradiction invisible. Carnegie's steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania, was one of the most productive industrial facilities in the world by 1892. It employed thousands of workers who made steel rails and steel beams that went into the infrastructure of a growing nation. The workers at Homestead belonged to a union called the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. They had a contract with Carnegie Steel. They had wages and working conditions that were, by the standards of the era, relatively decent, a result of years of negotiation and the fact that the union was organized and capable of collective action. In 1892, Carnegie Steel's contract with the union was up for renewal. Henry Clay Frick, who ran Carnegie Steel's day-to-day operations as chairman, announced that the company intended to cut wages significantly. He also announced that whether or not the union agreed to the new terms, the company intended to run the plant. If the union would not work under the new terms, the plant would operate with non-union workers instead. The union went on strike in late June of 1892. Frick responded immediately. He locked the workers out of the plant, surrounded the entire facility with a new fence topped with barbed wire and punctuated with platforms where guards could stand watch, and hired 300 men from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a private security firm that had built much of its business around exactly this kind of work, providing armed men to corporations dealing with labor disputes. The Pinkertons were brought in by barge on the Monongahela River on the night of July 5th and into the early morning of July 6th, 1892. The workers had been watching the river. When the barges were spotted, thousands of people gathered on the riverbank and at the plant's entrance. What followed was a battle that lasted for most of the day. The Pinkertons tried to land and take control of the plant. The workers fought to stop them. Both sides had weapons. When the fighting ended, 9 workers were dead and 7 Pinkerton men were dead. Dozens more were injured on both sides. The Pinkertons eventually surrendered and were escorted away from the plant by the workers, who were by that point in control of the property they had just defended at a cost of 9 of their own lives. The battle was reported in newspapers across the country. It was one of the most significant confrontations between workers and private security forces in American history, and the country was following it. Andrew Carnegie, during all of this, was at Skibo Castle in the Scottish Highlands. He was on one of his regular extended visits to the country of his birth, staying at the estate he had purchased and renovated into a residence appropriate for the wealthiest man in America. He and Frick exchanged written communications throughout the crisis. The decisions about how to handle the strike, the fence, the Pinkertons, the lockout strategy, were coordinated between them. Carnegie's correspondence from this period shows a man aware of what was happening and directing, or at minimum endorsing, Frick's approach. He was not simply uninformed and far away. He was uninformed and far away and in agreement. The Pennsylvania governor sent 8,500 National Guard troops to Homestead after the battle on the river. The troops took control of the plant. Non-union workers were brought in under military protection. The strike continued for months, but without the ability to stop production, its leverage was gone. By November 1892, the strike was over. The union at Homestead was destroyed. It did not recover meaningful strength at that plant for decades. The wage cuts went through. The conditions Frick had proposed at the start of the dispute became the conditions under which the plant operated. 9 workers had died. The outcome of their deaths was that the company got what it had wanted from the beginning. Now place this next to There Will Be Blood, and look at what they share. Daniel Plainview is present for the violence his operation produces, but present in a specific way. He is there when accidents happen, when the well blows out and HW is deafened, when workers are injured. But he does not experience these events the way the people directly inside them do. He processes them as operational events, as things that happened in the course of the work, as costs. There is a scene early in the film where a worker is killed in an accident at one of his early oil wells, and Plainview picks up that worker's baby and keeps moving. The death registers. He responds to it, but what he does with it is adopt a child who will be useful to him and move forward. Carnegie was doing the same accounting from Scotland. The deaths at Homestead registered. The coverage was unavoidable. But what he did with it, in the immediate term, was continue to coordinate with Frick, support the outcome that the confrontation produced, and move forward. What Carnegie did afterward, and this is the piece that makes him different from Plainview in ways that matter, was spend the rest of his life giving the money away. He sold Carnegie Steel in 1901 to a banker named J.P. Morgan for $480 million, making the transaction the largest private industrial sale in American history at that point. Carnegie's personal share made him, at that moment, the richest man in the world. He then spent the remaining 18 years of his life in systematic, dedicated philanthropy on a scale that had never been attempted before. He funded the construction of 2,500 public libraries across the United States, the United Kingdom, and other countries. Buildings where anyone could walk in and read, regardless of what they owned or where they came from. He funded Carnegie Hall in New York City, which opened in 1891 and still stands. He established the Carnegie Institution for Science, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and numerous other foundations. He donated more than $350 million during his lifetime, most of his fortune, to causes he believed would benefit humanity. He wrote, later in his life, that the man who dies rich dies disgraced. He meant it as a statement of his philosophy. that wealth accumulated beyond personal need was a responsibility, not a reward, and that the failure to use it for public benefit was a kind of moral failure. He also said, in an interview late in his life, that the event at Homestead was the one great blot on his career, a shadow he could not fully escape, that he carried with him through all the libraries and the concert halls and the foundations, through all the public good he spent his later decades constructing. He never reversed the wage cuts. The union that was destroyed at Homestead stayed destroyed. The workers who lost their livelihoods, and the families of the 9 men who were killed, received no direct restitution from the man who had been at his castle while the fighting happened. The philanthropy went to the public broadly. The people most directly damaged by Homestead got what everyone else got: access to a Carnegie library, if one was built in their city. This is the detail that There Will Be Blood is most precise about in its portrait of Plainview, and it is the detail that the Carnegie story confirms from the outside. The man who accumulates through methods that cause harm to real people does not typically direct the repair of that harm back to the specific people who suffered it. The repair, when it comes at all, gets distributed broadly and publicly, in ways that build the accumulator's legacy rather than settling his specific debts. Carnegie's libraries are real. They are genuinely good things. People have used them and benefited from them for over a century. None of that changes the accounting at Homestead. The 9 dead workers, the destroyed union, the wage cuts that went through because 9 people died, and the strike was still broken anyway. Both things exist simultaneously, and the libraries do not cancel the workers any more than Plainview's genuine capacity to find oil cancels what he does to the people whose land sits above it. The distance that Carnegie maintained, geographically, psychologically, structurally, between himself and the consequences of his operation, is exactly the distance that made accumulation at that scale possible. You cannot watch the barge arrive with 300 armed men and still believe cleanly in your own gospel of wealth. You can believe it from Scotland, across written communications, through a manager who handles the operational details, while you are renovating a castle and planning your next philanthropic gift. Plainview maintains the same distance inside himself. He is present for the violence, but not inside it. He watches the oil well explosion that deafens his son and keeps working. He manages every transaction at a remove that protects the image he has built of himself from the reality of what the transactions cost. Carnegie kept that distance for as long as he was building the empire. When the empire was sold, he spent 18 years trying to close it, one library at a time. Whether a library closes the distance between a man's legacy and 9 people dead on a riverbank in Pennsylvania is a question the history books have been debating for over 100 years without settling it. Plainview does not build any libraries. He does not even try. By the end of the film, he has stopped performing the distance entirely and sits directly inside what he has become, with no buffer left between himself and the thing his accumulation produced. The bowling alley, the bottle, the body. There is no Scotland to go to. There is only the room. Carnegie chose a different ending. He gave the money away and died in 1919 at the age of 83, internationally celebrated, mourned by the institutions he had funded, remembered as a great man who had also done a terrible thing. The terrible thing did not disappear. The great man received the obituaries. The oil that made all of these fortunes possible, Doheny's, Rockefeller's, Plainview's, kept coming out of the ground through all of it. It did not stop for the workers at Homestead, or the Osage in Oklahoma, or the investors reading false financial statements. And when the companies built to extract it grew large enough that a single decision made in a boardroom, or a barge, or a distant castle could determine whether thousands of people kept their jobs or lost them. The distance between the man at the top and the consequence at the bottom grew so large that it became a kind of architecture. Structural, load-bearing, designed to keep the view from the top clear and the noise from the bottom quiet. That architecture, the distance between decision and consequence, built deliberately into the structure of large organizations, is what made possible the next chapter of this story. Because Enron did not require its executives to watch the retirement accounts drain, the banks that sold mortgage products in 2008 did not require their traders to meet the families who lost their houses. The distance that Carnegie had to travel to Scotland to create, the men who came after him had built directly into the walls of the institutions they ran. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Carnegie at least knew what he had done. He called Homestead the one great blot on his career, and spent 18 years trying to build something large enough to cast a shadow over it. The men who came after him, operating inside corporations rather than as individual owners, had the advantage of a structure that made knowing what you had done considerably harder to arrange. Section 7. The smartest guys in the room. In the year 2000, Enron Corporation was ranked 7th on the Fortune 500 list of the largest companies in America. Its stock price had climbed to over $90 a share. Its annual revenue was reported at $100 billion. Thousands of employees had their retirement savings tied up in company stock because the company had told them repeatedly and with great confidence that the stock was going up. Financial analysts across Wall Street rated Enron as a strong buy. Magazines celebrated its executives as visionaries. Its chief executive, a man named Jeffrey Skilling, was described in the press as one of the most brilliant business minds of his generation. 16 months later, Enron filed for bankruptcy. The stock was worth pennies. More than 20,000 employees lost their jobs, the retirement savings of those workers. Money they had been putting away for decades, money meant to carry them through the end of their lives, were gone. Investors lost billions of dollars. The accounting firm that had been certifying Enron's finances as accurate and honest was destroyed along with its client. 22 people were eventually convicted of crimes connected to the fraud. The company that financial analysts had spent years praising as a model of modern business had been, for most of its celebrated life, a lie held together by paperwork. Enron was founded in 1985 when a man named Kenneth Lay merged two natural gas pipeline companies together. The combined company eventually took the name Enron in 1986. In its early years, it was a straightforward business. It owned pipelines. Gas moved through those pipelines, and the company charged fees for moving it. Not glamorous, but real. The pipelines existed. The gas moved. The money came from an actual service being provided. Then the American government changed the rules around energy markets in the early 1990s, allowing companies to trade energy contracts rather than just physically deliver energy. Enron saw this as an opportunity and moved quickly. Under the direction of Jeffrey Skilling, who started as a consultant and rose to become the company's president and then chief executive, Enron transformed itself from a pipeline company into an energy trading company. Instead of owning physical infrastructure and charging for its use, it would act as a middleman, buying and selling contracts for energy delivery and collecting fees and profits from the trades. This shift made Enron harder to understand from the outside and much easier to manipulate from the inside. Skilling hired aggressively, pulling in graduates from the top business schools in the country. building a culture that prized winning above everything else. He created an internal review system where employees were ranked against each other every year, and the lowest ranked 15 to 20% were fired, regardless of how they performed in absolute terms. The system rewarded people who closed deals and punished people who raised concerns or moved cautiously. The message, communicated through every structure and incentive the company built, was that being right mattered less than being bold, and that caution was weakness. Andrew Fastow rose through this culture to become Enron's chief financial officer. His job was to manage the company's money and to keep its finances in order. What he actually did was construct a web of outside partnerships, separate companies, set up specifically to do business with Enron, that allowed Enron to move debt off its books. When Enron made a bad investment or took on obligations it could not afford, Fastow's partnerships would absorb those losses, making them disappear from Enron's official financial statements. The debt still existed. It had not been paid off or resolved. It had been shuffled into a place where the people reading Enron's public documents could not easily see it. The result was that Enron looked profitable when it was not. It looked financially healthy when it was carrying billions of dollars in hidden obligations. Its published numbers said one thing. The reality behind those numbers said something entirely different. Kenneth Lay, who served as Enron's chairman and at various points as its chief executive, signed off on the company's public financial statements. He appeared in front of investors and employees and described Enron as sound, as growing, as a company with a strong future. He continued doing this as the evidence of the company's actual condition piled up around him. In August of 2001, a vice president at Enron named Sharon Watkins sent Lay an internal memo. She told him directly that Enron might implode in a wave of accounting scandals. She described the partnerships Fastow had created and explained why she believed they were hiding losses that would eventually have to be recognized. She was not a junior employee who had stumbled onto something she did not understand. She was a senior figure who understood the company's finances well enough to see clearly what was happening and to say so in writing to the chairman. Lay commissioned a law firm to review her concerns. The law firm cleared the company. The practices continued. 3 months later, Enron announced a loss of $638 million for 1 quarter and a reduction of $1.2 billion in the value held by shareholders, in part because of Fastow's partnerships. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the government agency that oversees financial markets, opened an investigation. The stock began to fall. As the details of the accounting practices came to light, the fall accelerated. Enron went from a $90 stock to a single-digit stock in a matter of weeks. On December 2, 2001, Enron filed for bankruptcy. At the time, its $63 billion in assets made it the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. The fraud had run, in various forms, for most of the previous decade. Through all of it, Enron's Code of Ethics, a document that Kenneth Lay personally signed, stated in its opening pages that Enron enjoyed a reputation for fairness and honesty, and that this reputation depended on its people. The document existed. It had been printed. People had signed it. And simultaneously, the executives who signed it were hiding billions of dollars in losses from the investors and employees who trusted them with their money. In 2006, both Skilling and Lay were convicted on charges of fraud and conspiracy. Skilling was sentenced to more than 24 years in prison, though he ultimately served 12. Lay was convicted and was facing more than 45 years in prison, but died of a heart attack before he could be sentenced. Fastow pleaded guilty in 2006 and was sentenced to 6 years in prison, released in 2011. 22 people were convicted in total. Thousands of people lost everything. Now look at what this story shares with There Will Be Blood. Because the overlap is not incidental, and it is not superficial. Daniel Plainview builds his entire public presence around a performed identity. He is the family man with the son. He is the community builder who promises schools and roads. He is the straight dealer who delivers what he says he will deliver. Every element of his public image is designed to make the people around him comfortable enough to give him what he wants: their land, their trust, their oil rights. The image is a tool. It is deployed with precision and maintained with discipline for as long as it is useful. Kenneth Lay built the same thing at a corporate scale. Enron's public image, the innovative company, the visionary leadership team, the model of modern business, was constructed and maintained with the same precision and for the same purpose. It kept investors comfortable enough to keep putting money in. It kept employees invested in company stock. It kept regulators and analysts from looking too hard at the numbers behind the presentation. The Code of Ethics document is the detail that makes this parallel most precise. Plainview does not announce that he is using his son as a prop. He does not tell the families of Little Boston that he is underpaying them for land sitting above an enormous oil deposit. He performs sincerity. Enron did not announce that its financial statements were being manipulated. It published a document about its commitment to honesty and had its executives sign it. It performed integrity. Both performances worked for years. Both collapsed under the weight of what they were concealing. There is a line Skilling said that became infamous after the company fell. When asked by an analyst about Enron's finances, he called the analyst an extremely rude name and hung up the phone. This was in April of 2001, 7 months before the bankruptcy. The company's stock had begun dropping, and the analyst had asked why Enron was the only major energy company that refused to publish a detailed financial statement alongside its earnings report. Skilling's response was to insult him and end the call. That response, the aggression, the contempt, the refusal to engage with a legitimate question, is recognizably Plainview. The film is full of moments where Plainview, challenged or pressed on something he does not want to discuss, responds not with explanation, but with force. He does not argue. He overwhelms. He makes the person asking the question feel small for having asked it. And in doing so, he redirects attention away from the question itself and toward the discomfort of the person who raised it. Skilling did this for years. The culture he built at Enron did this systematically. People who raised concerns were managed out or sidelined. Sharon Watkins, who put her concerns in writing to the chairman, was not fired, but the concerns were buried. The man she reported to had already decided that the concerns were inconvenient, and inconvenient things at Enron had a way of disappearing into the same place as the debt. The employees who lost their retirement savings had been told their savings were safe. In the final months before the bankruptcy, some executives were quietly selling their own Enron stock while publicly telling employees and investors that the company was fine. The employees, many of whom had their retirement accounts locked in Enron stock by the company's own rules, could not sell. The people at the top sold. The people at the bottom held on to what they had been told was valuable until it was worth nothing. That transfer, from the people who believed the performance to the people who built it, is the final move in both stories. Plainview extracts everything he can from every person and community he passes through, and they are left with what he chose to leave behind, which is never as much as he promised. Enron's executives extracted their own wealth while the company was collapsing, and the people who had believed in the company were left holding stock that was worth pennies. There is one more detail that belongs in this picture, and it connects Enron to the larger story this essay has been building. Enron was an energy company. It did not drill for oil the way Plainview did, but energy, the buying and selling and moving of it, was the business it was in. The industry that Doheny built from a sharpened tree trunk, that Rockefeller organized into a monopoly, that Albert Fall tried to redirect with a bag of cash, that the Osage people sat on top of while men around them arranged their deaths. That industry had, by the late 20th century, become so vast and so complex that you could build a company worth $60 billion in it without ever putting a drill in the ground. You could trade the idea of energy, the promise of future delivery, the contract that said the gas would be there when you needed it. And you could fake all of it for a decade, and the people whose job it was to check the numbers would not catch it until it was already over. The distance between the man with the sharpened tree trunk in 1893 and the executives signing ethics documents in 2001 is enormous in time and in complexity. The underlying transaction is the same. Someone had something, someone else wanted it, and the person who wanted it built a story sophisticated enough to take it without the original owner realizing what was happening until the glass was empty. What came after Enron was supposed to be different. New laws were passed, new oversight was created, new rules were written to make sure the accounting fraud that had kept Enron's real condition hidden for years could not happen again. And for a few years, it seemed like those new rules might be enough. Then the banks got involved with something even more invisible than energy contracts, and the entire global economy found out what happens when the straw gets long enough to reach everyone's glass at once. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Enron's fraud was built on paper, false numbers, hidden partnerships, documents that said one thing while the reality said another. What made it possible was distance between the executives signing the statements and the accounts those statements described, between the performance of a healthy company and the actual condition underneath it. BP removed the paper entirely. What happened in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010 was the same logic made physical. Cost over safety, speed over caution, the bottom line over the 11 men on the platform. And there was nothing abstract about any of it. Section 8. The rig that was 6 weeks behind. On the night of April 20th, 2010, a surge of natural gas shot up through a pipe on an oil drilling platform in the Gulf of Mexico and ignited. The explosion killed 11 workers instantly. 17 more were injured. The platform, called the Deepwater Horizon, burned for 2 days before sinking to the bottom of the ocean on the morning of April 22nd. The pipe it had been drilling into, a well nearly 4,000 feet below the surface of the water, and then another 13,000 feet down through rock, was left open and rupturing, pumping crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico at a rate that the government would later estimate peaked at more than 60,000 barrels a day. The well was not capped for 87 days. By the time it was sealed, the United States federal government estimated that 4.9 million barrels of oil had discharged into the Gulf, the largest marine oil spill in the history of the petroleum industry. The oil contaminated approximately 400 square miles of the ocean floor. It fouled 1,300 miles of coastline across 5 states: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Texas. More than 80,000 birds were estimated to have been harmed, across at least 102 different species. Thousands of marine animals, dolphins, sea turtles, fish, crabs, oysters, died in the weeks and months that followed. And researchers found that many species in the region were still struggling to recover years later. BP, the oil company that operated the well, eventually put its own final estimate of the total cost of the disaster at $61.6 billion. That number included the fines, the settlements, the cleanup costs, and the legal judgments. In 2012, BP pleaded guilty to 14 criminal charges and paid a $4 billion criminal fine, the largest criminal penalty ever paid by a single company in American history at that time. BP was also required to pay more than $20 billion in civil settlements with the federal government and 5 states. None of this happened because of an unforeseeable accident. That is the central fact of Deepwater Horizon. The fact that every investigation, and inquiry, and court proceeding eventually returned to. The disaster was the product of choices. Specific, documented choices made by specific people under specific pressures. And those choices were made because the rig was 6 weeks behind schedule and millions of dollars over budget. And the pressure to finish and move on was more powerful in the moment than the pressure to be safe. The Deepwater Horizon was drilling what was known as the Macondo well, in a section of the Gulf of Mexico called the Mississippi Canyon. BP was the primary operator of the well, holding a 65% share. The rig itself was owned and operated by a separate company called Transocean, which had leased it to BP. A third company, Halliburton, had been contracted to handle the cementing work, the process of sealing the well with concrete to prevent oil and gas from escaping through the sides of the pipe. The delays that had pushed the project 6 weeks behind schedule had already cost significant amounts of money. Every day a drilling rig sits in the ocean costs the company operating it enormous sums. The lease on the Deepwater Horizon alone was running at approximately $500,000 a day. The pressure to finish was not abstract. It was measurable in daily costs, tracked against a schedule that was already badly off course. In the days and weeks before the explosion, BP made a series of decisions about how to complete the well. Each decision was faster and cheaper than the available alternatives. Each one reduced a margin of safety. One of the most significant involved the design of the well casing, the steel pipe running down through the rock to the oil reservoir. There were 2 main options. One involved a more complex design, using 2 separate pipes, one inside the other, with a seal connecting them. This design provided an additional barrier against gas escaping upward through the well. The other option was a single, long pipe running all the way from the ocean floor down to the reservoir. BP chose the single pipe design. Engineers later described this choice as unusual and noted that it provided fewer barriers against the kind of gas surge that ultimately caused the explosion. The cementing work performed by Halliburton, which was meant to seal the space between the pipe and the surrounding rock, was later found to have been done improperly. A government investigation identified the cement job as a primary factor in allowing the gas to escape. Tests conducted before the explosion had produced results that experienced drillers would normally have treated as warning signs. Those results were either misread or disregarded. On the night of the explosion, workers on the rig were conducting what is called a negative pressure test, a check to determine whether the well was properly sealed and safe. The test results were ambiguous. The readings suggested that gas might be moving up through the well in a way that indicated the seal was not holding. 2 different groups of workers, from BP and from Transocean respectively, interpreted those readings differently. BP's representative on the rig concluded the results were acceptable. The drilling team proceeded. Approximately 2 hours later, the gas reached the platform. The federal investigation that followed found that BP had been found guilty not just of negligence, but of gross negligence in causing the disaster. Gross negligence, in legal terms, means something more than a mistake or an error in judgment. It means a serious and unjustifiable failure to meet a basic standard of care, an almost complete disregard for the safety of others. The court that made this finding was using precise legal language, but the meaning is plain. The decisions that led to the explosion were not honest mistakes made by people trying their best. They were the foreseeable result of a corporate culture that had consistently prioritized speed and cost savings over the basic physical safety of the people working on its rigs and the environment surrounding them. This was not the first time BP had been found to have done this. In 2005, an explosion at BP's Texas City oil refinery killed 15 workers and injured 180 others. An investigation found that the explosion was caused by a failure to maintain proper safety standards at the facility, and that BP had been cutting costs at the refinery in ways that compromised those standards. BP paid a fine of $21 million in connection with the Texas City disaster. At the time, the largest fine ever imposed by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the government agency responsible for workplace safety. In 2006, a BP pipeline in Alaska leaked 267,000 gallons of crude oil onto the North Slope, the largest oil spill ever recorded in that region. The leak was caused by corrosion in the pipeline. Investigators found that BP had known the pipeline was corroding and had delayed the inspections and maintenance that might have caught the problem before it became a rupture. 3 separate disasters across 5 years, each one connected to the same pattern. Costs cut, maintenance deferred, warnings either missed or set aside, and the consequences falling on workers and the surrounding environment rather than on the company's bottom line. BP's chief executive at the time of the Deepwater Horizon disaster was a man named Tony Hayward. In the days after the explosion, as the scope of the disaster became clear and cameras began capturing the oil spreading across the Gulf, Hayward made a series of public statements that drew enormous criticism. He said that the environmental impact of the spill would be very, very modest. He said that the Gulf of Mexico was a very big ocean. He said, at a moment when 11 families were grieving workers who had died on his company's rig, that he wanted his life back. He later apologized for that last statement. He stepped down as chief executive in October of 2010, 6 months after the explosion. The 11 men who died on the Deepwater Horizon did not get their lives back. Now look at what There Will Be Blood is doing with this pattern, because the film makes the same argument about the relationship between accumulation and consequence that the Deepwater Horizon story makes in the real world. Daniel Plainview's operation kills people. A worker dies in an early accident at one of his wells, and Plainview adopts the dead man's child and keeps drilling. There are other accidents, other injuries. The blowout that destroys his infrastructure and permanently deafens his son. Each time, the response is operational. The dead man is absorbed into the story as a reason to keep going. Plainview has a son now, a business partner, a family man's image. The deafened child becomes, eventually, a liability and then a stranger. The oil keeps coming out of the ground. BP's operation killed people. 11 on the platform in 2010, 15 in Texas City in 2005. The response, in each case, was legal and financial. Fines were paid. Statements were issued. The drilling continued. BP is still one of the largest oil companies in the world. The structure of the argument the film is making becomes clearest here. In this case, because the Deepwater Horizon disaster removes any ambiguity about what is actually being traded. At Enron, people lost money. At Standard Oil, people lost their businesses.
At Teapot Dome, the public lost oil that belonged to the Navy. At Homestead, workers lost their union, and 9 of them lost their lives. At Deepwater Horizon, 11 men died on a platform because the company operating it had decided, across years and multiple facilities, that the cost of proper maintenance and adequate safety margins was money better spent elsewhere. The trade is explicit. Human safety for money. Environmental protection for schedule.
11 lives for the profit margin of a company that was already one of the most profitable corporations on Earth. Plainview makes the same trade repeatedly across the film, and the film never lets him be unaware of it. He knows what the oil costs. He knows what it costs the land, the communities, the people who trusted him. He continues because the logic of accumulation does not contain a mechanism for stopping. Once the engine is running, the question is never whether to stop. The question is only what to do next with what the engine produces. BP's total penalties and settlements from the Deepwater Horizon disaster eventually reached amounts that were genuinely historic. More than $60 billion. The largest criminal penalty ever paid by a single company. The largest environmental settlement in American history. Numbers so large, they are difficult to hold in the mind as real. The Deepwater Horizon oil field, after all of that, went back into production. The logic of the oil industry, find it, extract it, sell it, move on, does not stop for the accounting of what the extraction cost. The oil was still there. The demand was still there. The lease was still valid. Different equipment, different operators, and the well that had been sealed after 87 days of open rupture was producing again. That continuation, beyond the disaster, beyond the fines, beyond the investigations and the criminal charges and the congressional hearings and the $61.6 billion reckoning, is the final image the film keeps circling back to. The oil does not stop. The machine does not stop. The people at the top of the machine absorb the legal consequences, pay what they are required to pay, and continue. The people in the water, and the people on the platform, and the people on the coastlines, they absorb the rest. What happened when an entire financial system applied this same logic, prioritizing short-term profit over the long-term safety of the people depending on it, was not a single disaster affecting a single region of a single ocean. It was a collapse that touched every country on Earth and left damage that took a decade to partially repair. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. BP's disaster was contained to a specific platform, a specific well, a specific stretch of coastline. Devastating, historic, and ultimately bounded by geography. What happened in 2008 had no geography. It was everywhere at once, in every bank account and every pension fund and every mortgage payment in the developed world. Because the people running it had figured out how to put the straw into everyone's glass simultaneously. Section 9. The glass everyone drank from. In 2006, roughly 1 in every 3 home loans being issued in the United States was given to someone who could not reliably afford to pay it back. This was not a secret inside the financial industry. The people writing the loans knew it. The companies packaging those loans into investment products and selling them to investors knew it. The ratings agencies that were supposed to evaluate those products and give investors an honest assessment of the risk knew it, or should have known it, and in many cases chose not to look too carefully, because looking too carefully would have slowed down a process that was making enormous amounts of money for everyone involved in it. What happened next? The collapse of the American housing market, the near destruction of the global financial system, the loss of trillions of dollars of ordinary people's wealth. is the largest single example in modern history of what greed looks like when it stops being the problem of one person or one company and becomes the operating logic of an entire system. It is also, in structure, the same story that There Will Be Blood tells. A product is created and sold to people who are told it is worth what they are paying for it. The people selling the product know the true value is much lower. They collect their money. The product fails. The people who bought it absorb the loss. The people who sold it, in many cases, do not. To understand what actually happened, the technical language has to be set aside, because the technical language was part of how the fraud stayed hidden for as long as it did. The products had complicated names. The structures were deliberately difficult to follow. The complexity was not accidental. It was useful, because complexity creates distance between the person selling something and the person's ability to evaluate what they are buying. In simple terms, here is what occurred. Banks were giving home loans to people who could not afford them. Those loans were then gathered into large bundles and sold to investors as investment products. The investors were told that these bundles were safe because even if some individual loans in the bundle defaulted, the bundle as a whole would hold its value. The ratings agencies, the companies whose entire purpose was to evaluate how risky these products were and give investors honest guidance, rated many of these bundles as the safest possible category of investment. They marked them as equivalent to government bonds, the most trusted financial instruments in the world. The ratings were wrong. The agencies gave those ratings because the banks were paying them for the ratings, and because the fees for rating these products were enormous, and because the volume of products needing ratings was so high that doing thorough analysis on each one would have slowed the business down. So they rated them safe. Investors bought them on that basis. The money flowed. Goldman Sachs was one of the major banks involved in creating and selling these products. Unlike most of the other large banks, Goldman's own traders had begun to grow skeptical of the housing market as early as 2004, years before the collapse. By late 2006, Goldman's internal management had made a decision to change the firm's overall position on the housing market from positive to negative. They believed internally that the products they had been creating and selling were built on a foundation that was going to give way. So they did two things at the same time. They continued creating and selling these products to investors, and they began placing financial bets that those same products would fail. A Senate investigation later described this as building and operating a machine that fed these products into the financial system, and then making large bets against the market they had helped create. One senator on the investigating committee described Goldman's position as similar to selling a car with broken brakes and then buying an insurance policy on the person who bought it. One specific deal became the clearest example of what Goldman had done. It involved a product called Abacus. Goldman created this investment product and sold it to investors. The investors were told that the specific collection of underlying loans inside Abacus had been selected by an independent outside manager, a company called ACA Management, whose job was to pick quality assets on behalf of the investors. What the investors were not told was that a hedge fund called Paulson & Company had played a significant role in selecting which loans went into Abacus. Paulson & Company was not working on behalf of the investors. Paulson was planning to bet against the product. They wanted loans that were likely to fail because their profits depended on the product failing. They helped design it to fail and then bet that it would. Less than a year after the deal was completed, 100% of the bonds inside Abacus had been downgraded, meaning they had been reassessed and found to be worth significantly less than investors had paid for them. Paulson & Company made approximately $1 billion from betting against the product they had helped design. The investors who had bought Abacus lost roughly the same amount. The Securities and Exchange Commission charged Goldman Sachs with securities fraud in April of 2010. In July of that year, Goldman agreed to pay $550 million to settle the charges. It was, at that time, the largest penalty ever paid by a Wall Street firm in a settlement with the SEC. Goldman neither fully admitted nor denied the core wrongdoing in that settlement, a standard feature of these resolutions that critics noted allowed the bank to pay the fine without formally acknowledging what it had done. In 2016, after a longer investigation by the Department of Justice, Goldman agreed to pay $5 billion to resolve further claims about its handling of mortgage products in the years leading up to the crisis.
As part of that settlement, the bank agreed to a statement of facts, a document in which it acknowledged specific conduct. The document stated that Goldman had falsely assured investors that the products it was selling were backed by sound mortgages, when it knew they were full of mortgages that were likely to fail. That language is significant. Not that Goldman had made optimistic projections that turned out to be wrong. Not that Goldman had been mistaken about the housing market. Goldman had falsely assured investors. It had known the mortgages were likely to fail. It had said otherwise. Those are not the same thing as being wrong. Being wrong is a mistake. Saying something you know to be false to someone who is about to give you their money is a different category of action. The collapse that followed when the housing market finally gave way in 2007 and 2008 was unlike anything the American economy had experienced since the Great Depression of the 1930s.
Major financial institutions that had existed for decades either failed or came within hours of failing. The government spent hundreds of billions of dollars bailing out banks and insurance companies whose collapse, officials believed, would have caused a complete breakdown of the financial system. An insurance company called AIG, which had been selling financial protection policies on these mortgage products without setting aside enough money to actually cover its obligations if the products failed, received $180 billion in government loans to prevent it from collapsing. Goldman Sachs received $12.9 billion through the government's rescue of AIG, because AIG owed Goldman money on exactly these kinds of policies. Goldman also received $10 billion directly from the government's emergency bailout program, announced in the fall of 2008 as the crisis peaked. In June of 2009, after repaying the government bailout money, Goldman made some of the largest bonus payments in its history. The firm set aside a record $11.4 billion in a single year for employee bonuses. 953 employees received bonuses of at least $1 million each. The New York Attorney General at the time publicly questioned Goldman's decision to pay those bonuses after having just received taxpayer money to survive a crisis that its own products had helped create. The bank paid them anyway. One banker went to prison as a direct result of the financial crisis. One. His name was Karim Sarageldin, and he worked at Credit Suisse, not Goldman. He was sentenced to 30 months in jail for manipulating bond prices to hide $1 billion in losses. He returned $24.6 million in compensation as part of his sentencing. No senior executives at Goldman Sachs or at any of the other major banks whose activities were at the center of the crisis were criminally charged. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, the official government body set up to investigate what caused the collapse, concluded in its final report that the crisis was the result of human action and inaction, not of uncontrollable forces or accidents. It found that the failures of the large financial institutions and of the agencies that were supposed to be watching them were preventable. It found that the ratings agencies, whose favorable assessments had made these products sellable, had given those ratings while the underlying quality of the loans was deteriorating rapidly. It found that regulators had been warned about widespread fraud in the mortgage market and had declined to investigate. The word the commission used, repeatedly, in describing what had happened at the highest levels of the financial industry, was the same word that gets used to describe Daniel Plainview, and Edward Doheny, and John D. Rockefeller, and Albert Fall, and William K. Hale, and Kenneth Lay. Greed. The Commission listed greed as one of the primary ethical explanations for the crisis. Not miscalculation. Not bad luck. Not a system that nobody fully understood, failing in ways nobody could have predicted. Greed. And its companion, a lack of any concern for the consequences that would fall on the people who were not in the room when the decisions were made. The people who were not in the room were the families who had taken out the home loans, many of whom lost their houses when payments became impossible. They were the pension funds and retirement accounts that had invested in the products Goldman and the other banks created. They were the workers whose employers, dependent on credit and investment, laid them off when the financial system contracted. 8 million Americans lost their jobs in the years following the crisis. Millions lost their homes. The people who were in the room, for the most part, remained in their rooms. There will be blood ends in a room. Plainview's room, his private bowling alley, the ultimate symbol of a man who has accumulated so much that he builds private entertainment spaces in the basement of his home because he has run out of things to do with the money and nowhere left to go with the person he has become. He sits in that room with a bottle and eventually with a body, and the film ends. The executives of Goldman Sachs did not end in rooms like that. They paid settlements and continued operating. The firm still exists. It is still one of the most powerful financial institutions on Earth. The crisis it helped create reshaped the global economy for a decade and left permanent damage in communities that had nothing to do with mortgage-backed investment products and could not have explained what one was if asked. That gap between the scale of the damage and the absence of personal consequence for the people most responsible for it is the thing that makes the 2008 financial crisis the most modern, the most complete, and in some ways, the most clarifying example of what There Will Be Blood is actually about. Plainview at least ends in the room with what he has done. He cannot escape it. The film makes sure of that. The real world, it turns out, is considerably more forgiving of the people who drink everyone's milkshake at the same time. But the story of greed in America does not only belong to the people who built the machines and ran them until they broke. There were people who watched those machines being built and tried to say so loudly enough that someone would listen. One of them was a journalist whose father's oil business was destroyed by Standard Oil's secret railroad deals. She spent years documenting exactly what had been done and how. And she did it at a time when taking on the most powerful corporation in the country was the kind of project that could end a career before it produced a single result. She did it anyway. And what she produced changed the country in ways that are still visible today. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 2008 collapse produced investigations, settlements, congressional hearings, and one prison sentence. It did not produce a Tarbell, someone who took the time to document what had happened in language clear enough that the people who had been harmed could finally understand what had been done to them and why. Tarbell did that work for Standard Oil a century earlier, and what she built from it was something none of the men in this essay ever managed to construct. A record that outlasted the power of the people it was written about. Section 10. The Woman with the Notebook. Ida Tarbell's father built his oil business on a handshake and a reasonable assumption. The assumption was this:
that if he worked hard, kept his costs down, produced a quality product, and competed fairly, the market would treat him fairly in return. This was not a naive belief in 1859, when the first oil well in American history was drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania, not far from where the Tarbell family lived. The oil industry was brand new. The rules were still being written. There was no dominant player yet, no company so large that it could rewrite the terms of competition for everyone else. A man with a good refinery and a serious work ethic had a genuine shot. Franklin Tarbell built a wooden storage tank for oil when the boom started, then moved into oil refining. He built something real. He employed real people. He made a real living. And then, Standard Oil arrived in his region of Pennsylvania, and within a period of years, the business he had built was destroyed. Not because he had done anything wrong, not because his product was inferior or his operation was poorly run. His business was destroyed because the rules he had been playing by were no longer the rules that applied, and he did not find out about the new rules until they had already finished him. His daughter watched this happen. She was a young woman at the time, living in a family that had built itself around her father's business, in a community that was being hollowed out by the same force that was hollowing out her father. She watched men she had known her whole life lose their livelihoods. She watched a town that had been prosperous and busy and full of people with futures ahead of them turn quiet and diminished. She did not forget any of it. Ida Tarbell became a journalist. She was one of a group of writers in the early 1900s that President Theodore Roosevelt eventually called muckrakers. People who dug into the dirt of powerful institutions and brought what they found into the light. The name was meant as a mild insult, a suggestion that these journalists were more interested in filth than in useful work. It did not stick as an insult. The journalists wore it without apology. In 1900, Tarbell began investigating Standard Oil. She spent 4 years on the project. She interviewed executives, studied documents, traced the history of the company's growth, and mapped out in precise detail the mechanisms that Rockefeller had used to build his monopoly. She published her findings across 19 consecutive articles in a magazine called McClure's, running from November of 1902 through October of 1904. She then collected everything into a 2-volume book called The History of the Standard Oil Company, published in 1904. The book documented the railroad rebate scheme in full. It showed, with specific evidence and named sources and documented transactions, that Standard Oil had negotiated secret discounts on its shipping costs with the major railroads. Discounts that no other refiner could access, that gave Standard an automatic cost advantage over every competitor before a single barrel of oil left a single building. Tarbell traced the mechanism of the South Improvement Company, a scheme from 1872 through which Standard Oil had tried to lock in these arrangements permanently. And she documented how that scheme had worked even after it was officially dissolved. Because the relationships and the power that produced it did not disappear when the company's name changed. She documented something else as well. Something that made the railroad deals even more damaging than they first appeared. Standard Oil did not only receive discounts on its own shipments. In certain arrangements, the railroads also paid Standard a portion of the fees collected from its competitors. Every time a rival oil refiner shipped oil on one of the major railroads, a cut of that payment went to Rockefeller. The competitors were not just paying higher rates than Standard. They were paying rates that actively subsidized the company destroying them. Their money was flowing into Rockefeller's pocket while they struggled to stay solvent. And they had no idea this was happening because the arrangements were secret. Within the first 3 months of 1872, Rockefeller had bought out, shut down, or driven into bankruptcy 22 of his 26 competitors in Cleveland.
The remaining 4 either joined Standard or survived in diminished form. This period was later called the Cleveland Massacre in historical accounts. Tarbell documented it in detail. Who the companies were, what happened to them, how many workers lost their positions, how many families were affected. The men who ran those companies had done nothing wrong. They had built real businesses through real work. They were eliminated not through competition, but through a rigged system that they had not known was rigged until it was over. Tarbell interviewed some of them for her book. She found men who were still, decades later, unable to fully account for what had happened to them. Because from the outside, from their position inside the competition, it had looked like ordinary market forces. They had lost on price. They had not been able to match Standard's costs. From where they stood, the conclusion was that they were simply not good enough, not efficient enough, not competitive enough. The truth, which Tarbell uncovered and documented and laid out in plain language, was that they had been perfectly good enough. They had been beaten by a system working against them in secret, not by a competitor who was simply better at the business. This is the detail that connects Tarbell's work most directly to There Will Be Blood. The film's most important piece of analysis is not in the famous milkshake scene. It is in the quieter moments, where Plainview operates with a kind of confidence that comes from knowing something the people around him do not know. When he buys land in Little Boston at prices the families consider fair, he knows what is under that land. They do not. When he sets up his operation around the Sunday property, acquiring every neighboring piece of ground, he understands the geometry of what he is building in a way the community cannot follow because they do not have his knowledge, or his resources, or his experience. He is not simply better at competing. He is operating on information and from a position that the people he is dealing with do not have access to. That asymmetry, one party to a transaction knowing something essential that the other party does not know, is precisely what Tarbell documented in Standard Oil's railroad deals. The competitors did not know about the rebates. The families whose oil land was being bought did not know about the deposits. The investors who bought Enron's stock did not know about the hidden debt. The people who purchased Goldman's mortgage products did not know the bank was betting against those same products. In every case across this essay, the mechanism of extraction depends on one party having information the other party is denied. Tarbell's book was the first major public documentation of how that information gap worked in the oil industry. She wrote it without the cooperation of Standard Oil. The company refused to participate in her investigation. And with significant personal risk, because Standard Oil had enormous legal and financial resources and a well-established practice of using those resources against people it considered threats. She published anyway. And the book caused a shift in public opinion so significant that it created the political conditions for the government to act. President Roosevelt's administration filed suit against Standard Oil in 1906, 2 years after Tarbell's book was published, under the Sherman Antitrust Act, a law passed in 1890 that was designed to prevent monopolies from controlling entire industries. The case moved through the courts for 5 years. In 1911, the Supreme Court ruled that Standard Oil was an unreasonable monopoly and ordered it broken into 34 separate companies. Tarbell had not caused this outcome alone. The legal and political forces that produced the breakup were complex, but her documentation of Standard Oil's practices, specific, sourced, written in language that a general reader could follow, was what turned the abstract concept of monopoly power into a human story about real people whose real businesses and real livelihoods had been destroyed by a system they had no part in designing and no means of fighting. Without that human story, the political will to pursue a company as powerful and well-connected as Standard Oil might never have gathered enough force to produce a trial, let alone a Supreme Court ruling. She lived to see Standard Oil broken up. She lived to see the reforms she had documented the need for become law. She worked as a journalist and lecturer until late in her life, dying in 1944 at 86 years old. She never married. She spent most of her adult life working, producing books and articles on topics from business to biography to the history of American industry. She wrote, late in her career, that she had not started out intending to be an enemy of Standard Oil or of John D. Rockefeller personally. She had started out trying to understand what had happened to her father in the community she grew up in. The investigation had followed the evidence wherever it led, and the evidence led to the same place every time, to a set of secret arrangements, invisible to the people affected by them, that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a small group, while the people outside that group paid the cost, without knowing what they were paying for or why. That description, a set of secret arrangements, invisible to those affected, concentrating wealth upward while costs flow downward, is as clean a summary of what There Will Be Blood is exploring as anything in the film's critical literature. Tarbell arrived at it not through film criticism or philosophical analysis, but through 4 years of reading documents and interviewing people whose lives had been reshaped by forces they could not see. Rockefeller himself, when asked about Tarbell's work, reportedly dismissed her as a woman who had never understood business and had let personal grievance shape what she presented as journalism. He said her characterization of Standard Oil's methods was inaccurate. He maintained this position for the rest of his life, even after the Supreme Court had ruled that the company was an unreasonable monopoly built on practices that violated federal law. The gap between Rockefeller's private assessment of his own conduct and the Supreme Court's public assessment of it is the same gap that runs through every figure in this essay. Plainview does not experience himself as a man who destroys communities and discards people. He experiences himself as a man who builds things, who finds oil where others cannot find it, who creates wealth out of ground that was just sitting there. Fall did not experience himself as a criminal. He experienced himself as a practical man solving a practical problem. Lay signed the Code of Ethics document. Heo called himself a friend to the Osage. The story each of them told about themselves was real to them, right up until the moment the external record made it impossible to maintain. Tarbell's contribution was to build that external record carefully enough and document it thoroughly enough and write it accessibly enough that the people outside the transaction, the public, the courts, the government, could finally see the gap between the private story and the public reality. She was one person with a notebook. She did not have subpoena power. She did not have access to private financial records beyond what sympathetic insiders were willing to share with her. She did not have the legal authority to compel anyone to answer her questions, and the most powerful corporation in the country had every reason to obstruct her and the resources to make obstruction effective. She published anyway, and the straw, for once, got shorter. What Tarbell understood, and what the film dramatizes through Plainview's arc across nearly 30 years, is that the damage greed does not stay inside the person who is doing the taking. It spreads. It moves through communities, through families, through systems, through generations. The Cleveland refiners that Rockefeller eliminated in 1872 did not simply close their doors and disappear. Real people lost real work. Towns built around those businesses contracted. Families that had been building something lost what they had built. The money that would have circulated through those businesses and those families flowed instead to a small group of people at the center of a trust that controlled 90% of the industry. That mathematics, The compression of wealth upward while its absence expands outward is what every section of this essay has been tracing. And none of the people at the center of those transactions thought of themselves as the person responsible for the outward expansion of that absence. That, above everything else, is what the film understands. Plainview is not lying to himself about what he is doing. He is telling himself a story in which what he does makes sense, in which the logic of accumulation is its own justification, in which winning is not a moral question, but a practical one. And that story holds together beautifully, right up until the moment it doesn't. Until there is nobody left who believes it, including him. The people who paid the price for Standard Oil's methods, for Enron's fraud, for the 2008 collapse, for the Teapot Dome bribes, for the Osage reign of terror. Most of them never got a tar bill. Most of the damage done by greed operating without limit does not get documented. The people who absorb it do not have the resources or the platform to make it visible. And the people who caused it have every reason to make sure it stays invisible. But the damage is real whether or not anyone writes it down. And it accumulates, the way oil accumulates in underground rock, pressing against the surface, looking for somewhere to go. The final lesson the film saves for last is the one that takes the longest to understand. Because Plainview's destruction, the drunk man in the bowling alley, the finished man surrounded by finished things, looks like punishment. It looks like the story delivering justice, the greedy man finally receiving what his greed earned him. But what the film is actually showing is not punishment. Plainview is not suffering because the world caught up to him. He is suffering because the thing that drove him was never going to be satisfied by getting what it wanted. And he got everything he wanted. And now there is nothing left for the engine to run on. The machine consumed him last. After everyone else, after every community and every relationship and every person who tried to get close enough to matter, after all of them, it turned around and consumed the man who built it. That is not a story about one man's greed. That is a story about what greed is. Underneath all the explanations and justifications and logic and paperwork. And the ending of that story has been the same every time, across every person and institution in this essay, across more than a century of the same transaction being run in different industries under different names with different amounts of money. The glass always ends up empty. The question is only who gets left holding it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.